Hello, and welcome to Distillations. I'm Alexis Petrick. In our previous episode of Distillations, we talked about how the 19th century was a perfect mix of chaos, technology, and paranormal activity. To complement that episode and to bring the conversation to more recent times, we interviewed Colin Dickey, the author of Ghostland, An American History in Haunted Places. In this interview, our host, Lisa Barry Drago, and our producer, Rigoberto Hernandez, talked to Dickey about the intimate relationship between technology and ghost hunting, why he's not interested in proving that ghosts are real, and what the ghost stories we tell reveal about our society.
Can you introduce yourself as you would like to be known?
Yeah, this is Colin Dickey. I'm the author of Ghostland, An American History in Haunted Places.
We were really struck by some of the stuff that you talk about in Ghostland and also about one of your pieces for The Atlantic that was about really the way that ghost hunting and technology are completely intertwined to a point where, ghosts in a sense don't even exist outside of the recording technology that we're talking about. So what's in the contemporary ghost hunter's toolkit?
Well, I think right now one of the main, technological devices people just use are audio recordings. I think really popular right now is the idea of EVP, electronic voice phenomenon, and the idea is that you would go to a room or a haunted place or whatever, and you would hit record on just sort of any audio recording device, and then you would, sort of ask questions to the empty room. And the idea is that when you play that audio back later, you may hear noises or perhaps voices that were not audible to the human ear in real time, but are sort of picked up by the audio recording. I think that's one of the more prominent kind of technological devices that gets used today.
Is there anything that ghost hunters are doing in particular with the technology? Because my husband is a recording engineer, actually, so I have a basement full of various preamps and things like that. Is there anything in particular that they're doing to the technology or like settings or tweaks or out-of-the-box things that they're using?
I suppose some are, although I don't know that it's all that necessary. I think one of the things that I find really interesting is that it's more about just using kind of low-grade technology than it is, hacking it or altering it. Another popular device, although one that I guess is somewhat controversial in the ghost hunting world, is a K2 meter, which is a device that was designed to detect electromagnetic fields. But because it's unshielded, it will pick up any kind of electromagnetic disturbance, anything from microwaves to AM radios. And so, again, the idea is that you would go into a place and if there was a paranormal experience, this K2 meter would register it, but the K2 meter will be set off by any number of things. And so, sort of the idea is not to really mod technology so much as to use technology in sort of unscientific, uncontrolled experiments and sort of see what you get. I mean, that being said, I have a thing called Boo Buddy, which is a K2 meter that's actually embedded in a teddy bear. The idea being that maybe the spirit of a child will be more likely to respond to a stuffed animal. So that's, I guess, a sort of modification of a technological device, but again, in a kind of funny, almost kind of rudimentary kind of way.
Oh my God. The teddy bear. That's incredible to me. But you said, you said sort of low grade technology. You're talking about not super high end, highly modded, super customized stuff, but stuff that comes out of a box in a sort of an affordable consumer level. What is it about this sort of low-grade aspect to the technology that's appealing? Why are these things being chosen?
What is most important is to get the signal-to-noise ratio up to a level where you can start interpreting the results. So if you have a highly controlled experiment, to determine if ghosts are real, you are much more likely, to get, a negative response, because you have eliminated the variables. So, you're not going to get any kind of false positives. And then, I suppose, maybe ghosts could materialize, but it's less likely to happen than if you sort of deliberately use something that is sort of low grade or maybe not really designed for the purpose you're employing it. And what you end up with is a lot of static, a lot of noise, both literal and kind of figurative, again, like the K2 meter going off because police car happens to be driving by at that moment and it picks up the radio of the police scanner and it interprets that as an electromagnetic field and then responds to it. And if you're not aware of the police car, it's really easy to say, oh, maybe that's a paranormal experience or something like that. So the goal is really just to tweak that signal to noise ratio to the point where you can start to work with it.
So this is really a question of interpretation then. This desire to find faulty or low-grade technology is about giving yourself the most room for interpretation then in the results.
For me, I try and really delve into, or try and stay away from diving into whether or not spirits, paranormal, ghosts, whatever, exist or not. Like I just, I guess I'm a little agnostic on that question. But what I do think it's fascinating is regardless of one's belief, I think that ghosts have become the medium, so to speak, of sort of how we approach and mediate our own relationship to technology through both kind of antiquated or low grade or sort of malfunctioning or misused technology, and also how we interpret sort of new cutting edge technology as well.
Could you say a little bit about that? About how does the sort of cutting edge technology come into this? If most ghost hunters are using the whatever, the dull edge, the spoon edge of technology.
So right, so ghost hunters as like a profession, I find are using kind of low grade or misused technology. The flip side is that most new technological developments are almost immediately sort of brought into a kind of relationship with the paranormal. So from the invention of the telegram and, almost immediately after the telegram was invented, the argument was, look, if you can communicate with living people across vast distances using these wires and electricity, then you can probably use a similar technology to communicate with the dead. And, one of the great early spiritualist publications is called The Spiritual Telegram. So, sort of immediately upon the telegram's innovation is this idea that it is both a metaphor for our understanding of the dead and also a literal kind of direction in which we could go technologically to communicate with ghosts. So you see that again and again. And like there's a story of, this family in the 1950s in Long Island whose TV becomes haunted by this woman this sort of ghostly image who appears and, freaks the family out so much that they have to turn the TV to face the wall. And again, like what is happening is that, the cathode rays are, and I honestly, I don't know cathode ray tube technology well enough to explain this accurately. So maybe this is not accurate, but you'll get the gist. But basically, that the tubes had burned out and they'd burned an after image of, a newscaster or somebody onto the TV. But, again, the family for whom this was still a new and not entirely understood technology encoded it as a haunting. And so pretty much as soon as a technology is invented, you'll find people who see it as a means of connecting with the dead or otherwise explaining our relationship to the dead.
And this is, of course, photography is one of the cases that you talk about as really being kind of an inception moment. I don't know if there's anything that stretches earlier than that, an earlier form of technology that sort of gets looped into this dual relationship between the living and whatever comes after the living. Is photography really the first technology that's adopted in that way?
I think probably technology and the telegram are probably neck and neck in that regard. Yeah, I mean, as soon as we understand how technology works, we have multiple exposures. And Mumler's first spirit photographs were accidents. He sort of accidentally overexposed a plate that ended up with a kind of ghostly image of another person. And he knew exactly what it was. He knew that, it was just a technical error, but it was so, haunting, for lack of a better word, that he recast himself as someone who could use the camera to connect with the dead and, and sort of famously built this career around making, double exposures that looked like, spirit photographs. So yeah, I would say that the telegram or the telegraph and photography are pretty much neck and neck in that sort of early flourishing of technological devices made to kind of mediate our relationship with ghosts.
And I know it's difficult to gauge the sincerity of anybody engaged. I mean, it's difficult to gauge anyone's sort of sincerity in what they're engaged with or what they're espousing. But it's interesting that in his case, it's kind of, what he says about it, it's kind of transparently that he recognizes an opportunity. It's not necessarily that he was moved to spiritual beliefs by what he had witnessed in his own work, because he was more aware than everyone else of the sort of technical specifications. But do you feel that there's a tension between people who might be using the technology and presenting the results and people who are consuming the results in some way and the varying levels of sincerity.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you. It's sort of difficult to really gauge that level of sincerity in the absence of outright confessions or, hucksterism, as in the case of Mumler. But I think that what you can say is that these misusing or misapplications of technology that produce these haunting effects, I think they are compelling and strange and uncanny, particularly to people who are not used to, a given technology and what its limitations are and what its defects and byproducts are. And so they become really kind of fascinating and compelling artifacts. And again, I think Mumler's photographs, eventually they get quite hokey, but the early ones, even knowing full well that they're hoaxes, they're still quite striking in some cases. They still really, kind of grab you and arrest you, even when you're fully aware of exactly what led to them being created.
There's some kind of phenomenological aspect to this, right? Listening to a ghost recording, looking at a ghost photograph. There has to be some kind of just, like back of the brain experience that these things evoke in some way.
What's always fascinating to me is the idea that, you and I, when you go through just your day-to-day existence, there are a flood, a cacophony of background noises that you, by habit, just know to tune out, that you don't even register. So, if you went for a walk in a city and then afterwards somebody asked you, what did you hear? You wouldn't even be able to list, a tenth of what you actually heard, just because so much of it would just come and go as just sort of background noise that you wouldn't ever actually process, on a cognitive level. And the difference between you and a audio recorder is that the audio recorder doesn't know how to do that. It doesn't know how to filter out what is valuable information and what is not. So it gives it to you all. And so listening, if you have a conversation with somebody and you remember the conversation, then you listen back to an audio of it, and suddenly you're finding that you can barely hear the person that you're talking to because of, the jackhammer and the car alarm and the birds and, all these other things that are in the background that you just instinctively tuned out, but the audio recorder, just assumed was, as valuable as the dialogue that it was recording. And again, that's where I think a lot of these EVP experiences come from, is that in the moment, again, unless you are a, believer in the paranormal, but, these sounds are there. But the difference between you and your EVP recorder is that you're unconsciously filtering them out of your conscious experience. But then when you go back and listen to the recording of yourself in a dark room asking these questions to, the emptiness, things that your brain had just immediately discarded as irrelevant, the audio recorder will play back to you, almost in this kind of way of like, well, maybe there's something of importance here. And that, I think that's sort of how these things sort of build and develop.
It must be very startling to hear something on the tape that you think you consciously know you didn't hear. Sitting in the room and hearing something and going, I didn't hear that. I was in the room, but I didn't hear that. This must not be coming through my ears. This must be coming through some other level.
Right. And particularly if you're in like an old building, something that sort of, is likely to be the kind of place that would be haunted. We've all heard like creaking houses, and that's kind of a spooky feeling. But I think that, again, I think we underestimate just how much noise is generated even in a very quiet environment, because we're just not used to focusing on it. And then, so then suddenly you listen back and you hear these things that you swore you weren't happening in real time. And it can be strange and uncanny, sure.
So one of the interesting things from reading, there's a chapter in which you're in LA with a group called Gula, which is a bunch of amateur ghost hunters where they gather to talk about spirits over spirits. They're interesting because those people, they kind of really dig into the history or find a reason why, like they find the truth behind what is supposedly haunted. And another person's trying to find meaning in themselves about it. But then in these meetings, you describe a scene in which there's like all these ghost hunters who are trying to get on TV. And you describe it as like, you feel like you were going in there and they were not discussing the interesting stuff. They were discussing the ways that they were going to prove that there were ghosts. But they're kind of missing the point. Can you tell us why proving that ghosts are real is kind of a fool's errand? And are they missing the point?
I guess that's my take on it. And I suppose that if someone came along with indisputable evidence of, the paranormal, I think that would be the opposite of a waste of time. That would be huge. That would be life-changing. That would change everything we knew about everything. So for people who think that they have a means to do that, I can see that as being a really vital. I mean, it's like, discovering, any other scientific, thing from, wormholes or splitting the atom or whatever. I mean, huge ramifications. But I think that it is uninteresting to me on a sort of day-to-day level because, again, these things aren't happening in controlled environments. These things are kind of, amateurs, no disrespect, but kind of, going into a spooky, disused hospital on a Friday night, running around in the dark. And that seems not to be the way to make, an earth-shattering scientific discovery. Like one of the guys I talked to had a very scientific, methodical idea about how to do that. And it involved lots of cataloging, lots of data, lots of controlled experiments. And, he sort of lamented that nobody else in the community was ever going to help him do anything to that level of specificity. And thus, any potential scientific discoveries were never going to happen. So I think that these other questions that you can ask of, our relationship to haunted spaces are more interesting to me because, they're just more likely to bear fruit in the kind of way in which people actually go about, experiencing haunted places.
Yeah. And like what's interesting is that those people who are more interested in that, they're not the ones getting on TV. They're not the ones getting TV shows.
Right. Well, yeah, no, I mean, and you're right, because it's not sexy, it's not cinematic, it doesn't kind of lend itself to those same kind of TV tropes. So, I guess audiences get the ghost hunters that they want, I guess, for better or for worse.
So if we have these kind of technologists of the glitch trying to prove that ghosts do exist, and science kind of steps in and tries to create these environments where they're saying, we're going to prove that ghosts don't exist, I actually see a tension there. And, I'm not sure either one of them are going to get the results that they are desiring.
Yeah. Oh, right. Because absolutely. Yeah. Because I mean, and again, this is why when I kind of formulated this book, I basically said to myself upfront, look, I'm not going to argue that ghosts exist, and I'm not going to argue that ghosts don't exist because it's such a circular argument. I mean, somebody who is a skeptic, you can manifest in front of them a floating blue person who can tell them details about their grandmother that nobody else would know. And that person will still tell you that ghosts don't exist and that it was a gas leak or something like that. And conversely, you can debunk ghosts and hoaxes all the livelong day, but somebody who believes in ghosts is going to continue to believe in ghosts. There are exceptions to both of these rules, but I felt like if I wrote a book that explicitly argued one or the other, it would basically, sort of involve kind of preaching to the converted, and I wasn't interested in doing that. And so to your point about scientists who see themselves as their goal to prove that ghosts don't exist, I mean, I think you can prove that a specific event or a specific story or a specific manifestation maybe was fictitious or unlikely or caused by something else or whatever. Yeah, once you get into the level of trying to blanketly prove that ghosts don't exist, you're back making a kind of sociological claim about what we believe and why we believe those things, I think more so than you are kind of pushing a kind of objective scientific approach, if that makes sense.
At the heart of your book, you're saying that like ghost stories exist so they create an avenues for us to express our anxieties about certain things, whether that's prisons, cemeteries, justice, ownership of land with Native Americans. What purpose do ghost stories have for people?
I think that's a really broad question and a really hard one to answer simply. I think that through the course of writing that book, the conclusion that I came to is that ghost stories really kind of lie at an intersection of a bunch of different belief systems and reasons, and they do a number of different things, and they do different things for some people. I mean, we've been talking about one thing that ghost stories and haunted legends do is allow us to kind of have a different kind of relationship with the technology that is in our lives. And, whereas I think another thing that they do is they allow us to process grief and mourning in a different kind of way. They are ultimately, I think, in a lot of regards, a meditation on how we live in the spaces that we build for ourselves. Like, why do some houses become haunted and others don't? Why do some buildings become haunted and others don't? I think all of this is kind of fed through the kind of matrix of ghosts and hauntings. And I think why I find the topic so compelling is because it seems like a very straightforward set of beliefs, but in fact, it's a really kind of elastic and malleable lens that you can fit over the world to make sense of a bunch of different things.
And so then, like, going into a little bit more specifics, like our ownership of land, like the middle class dream of owning land, and whether is it really our land if we have a piece of deed that says it's our land? Can you talk about that tension a little bit?
When I started this book, and I just started to kind of make a kind of catalog of ghost stories and hauntings and kind of what forms they took. I mean, almost immediately, as a child of 80s horror movies, you kind of can't avoid, or at least I couldn't, the cliche of the Native American burial ground, that the suburban house is haunted because it's built on an Indian burial ground. And that comes up again and again, specifically in horror movies, kind of starting with the Amityville Horror in the late 70s. And it becomes kind of overnight, it becomes a kind of almost cliche, a thing that gets like parodied in sitcoms and stuff like that. And so, trying to sort of untangle why is that such a durable kind of narrative, I mean, it seems that it becomes a way for, particularly white Americans, Anglo-Americans, to kind of approach the Native American genocide and the colonial appropriation of Native American land without necessarily having to face it head on. So like, one of the things that comes up again and again, it comes up in William Burroughs, it comes up in Stephen King, it comes up in the 2016 sort of reboot of Ghostbusters. Again and again, there's this idea that there was an evil in the land that predated the Native Americans, and that becomes a kind of cliche that I think is a kind of convenient get out of jail free card, because then it sort of says like the Native American genocide was not something that was a calculated colonization and expropriation of native land by Anglo settlers. It was white people sort of being possessed by this primal fundamental evil that the Native Americans knew about themselves. And, it sort of perversely turns us white people into the victims of this evil. And so it sort of becomes a kind of way of expiating that kind of guilt. Again, I mean, I think that's a pretty negative way in which these ghost stories can be used, but it's one of many.
Yeah. And then staying in that realm of like anxieties over genocides and racial justice is like the stories coming out of Shockoe Bottoms in Arlington, Virginia, in which some of the most famous ghost stories are all white ghosts. But in fact, Arlington, Virginia was almost as similar to New Orleans in having a huge role in the slave trade. Where are all the black ghosts in Shockoe, Virginia?
It started again when I was doing my very early kind of brainstorming for places I wanted to look at and types of things I wanted to look at. And I was like, well, I want a haunted downtown, and so I just started Googling most haunted downtown in America, I think, or something like that. And I got a couple hits for, I got hits all over the place. I got a couple hits for Shockoe Bottom in Richmond, Virginia, which I didn't know anything about. So I delved into it and I started looking up these stories associated with Shockoe Bottom and, all sorts of, brothels and bars and restaurants and various other things. And it just sort of started to nag on me after a while that every story I was reading was about white ghosts, and we're talking about the capital of the Confederacy here. We're talking about the second most heavily trafficked slave market in the South, and a place of unspeakable historical trauma. And one of the ideas about ghosts is they linger around in kind of unjust or incomplete justice that hasn't been righted yet. Why aren't we seeing black ghosts in Richmond, Virginia? And and again, it started as just a very naive question for me. Of just what, like I expected to see something. I don't even know if I expected to see something, but the more that I looked, the more I started to wonder, why am I only seeing one version of this story? And that, kind of led to, following that path and sort of figuring out not just why are these stories the ones told in Shockoe Bottom, but who are these stories told to and by, and why are they told for these audiences, and what's the point there?
Yeah. And in fact, like it's interesting because you make an interesting comparison about how like slavery was a way to kind of make the living ghost, like basically taking out all their humanity so that they're shell of themselves. But then vice versa is like by giving them story and history, like the way that ghost stories do, then you're kind of making them human. You're kind of making them real. It's like a paradox.
Right, exactly. Yeah, because, in a kind of superficial, but I think really important and crucial way, what ghost stories do is they are kind of a form of folk history. They are how we remember the history of, that house on the corner or, the old bar downtown or something like that. And so they are a record of this country, even if they are, not, kind of standard historical work. And so I think that when that record becomes dominated by certain kind of people, I mean, that's worth kind of looking at and asking why that is.
I find one of the threads that I feel like you're kind of drawing on here is ghost stories act as if their function is to reveal a secret history sometimes. I think there's a sort of like you would never know this. There's no way that we could have known this if there hadn't been this haunting that kind of surfaced. This haunting is what surfaced this history. But in terms of things like the Native American genocide or the all-white cavalcade of Virginia ghosts, these aren't secrets. Actually, these are distasteful histories, to certain people. These things might seem distasteful, but they weren't secrets.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that on the one hand, this is kind of held up as the kind of secret, forgotten history of the United States. And sometimes it is that, but then because it sort of has this, kind of badge of being the kind of secret, forgotten history, it actually ends up kind of capable of reinscribing the dominant narratives because, when even the secret underground history of a place is entirely about white people, then, you're kind of doubling down on a problem with, mainstream history generally.
Yeah, and sometimes these ghosts are represented like in a kind of literal way. Like at least that's the way I interpret it, like the origins of the KKK, as was described in your book, in which there's like lore about KKK members going into freed slaves' homes, and they would wear white sheets, and they would like make holes into their drinking utensil to pretend that they were drinking endlessly, and they would shake hands and give the hand like a fake skeleton hand. That was actually for a purpose, and what they wanted to keep black people out and like people who view freed slaves as free slaves, not like something they can own. Are the KKK a kind of ghost?
Oh yeah, I mean absolutely, yeah. And again, I mean I think that's a fascinating kind of lens into the whole scope of the book because right, the KKK begins as almost, like a kind of fraternity of pranksters, and then immediately becomes something much darker and more violent, sort of right out of the gate. But they kind of continue this terrorism by prank methodology. So you have these, congressional testimony of freed former slaves who will describe a group of white men showing up at their door at midnight, visibly drunk, aggressive and hostile, and yet claiming themselves to be, the ghosts of the men who died at, the Battle of Manassas or something like that. Even when I was growing up, into the 80s, there was still a very common racist stereotype about black people being more superstitious or more sort of likely to be scared by ghosts than white people, sort of very old and tired racist trope. And you see its origins here where you have a bunch of threatening, violent men showing up at, some guy's door at midnight. And is he going to look, afraid? I mean, I would, in this sense that not of ghosts, but of men who claim to be ghosts and who may very likely do him harm, And so all these things become a kind of reaffirming feedback loop of the way in which white supremacy and violence kind of run alongside a kind of, metaphoric and kind of figurative realm where the two kind of constantly reinforce each other in sort of these important and kind of vile ways.
I want to talk about our hometown prison that is supposedly haunted, and that's Eastern State Penitentiary. Where do prisons exist in our collective mind when it comes to ghost stories?
Eastern State is built like a cement brick, smack dab in Philadelphia. And when it was built sort of on the outskirts of the city because the city wasn't as big then. And, the idea as in today is you would build prisons kind of out and away from the population. But, as Philadelphia expands, it expands, eventually right into Eastern State. And it's a big monumental building that's sort of hard to tear down because it's built to, keep people from escaping and that kind of stuff. And so I think on a just kind of infrastructural level, one of the things that's really fascinating is the way that a lot of haunted places are places that have just sort of outlived their usefulness, but yet are, for one reason or another, kind of too big to fail, too big to be torn down, too heavy, too expensive. Greystone in New Jersey, which was an asylum, Kirkbride Asylum, that I talk a little bit about in the book, because Kirkbride asylums are often the ones that get labeled as haunted. I mean, Greystone cost something like $42 million to tear down, because it was just like a solid, it's just stone, concrete, and brick, and, just rooted to the ground, and it was massive. And the only reason it came down was Chris Christie sort of had a personal vendetta against that building. Whereas, other Kirkbride asylums, which were fantastically large and similarly structured, either just sort of get abandoned or they get repurposed as malls or office spaces or, whatever, something, just because it's sort of like these kind of albatrosses, around the neck of their various communities. And so I think of Eastern State as sort of kind of emblematic example of that, only more so just because, it's Philadelphia. So it is a big city. It was kind of the first of its kind of those kind of prisons. And yet it kind of has kind of lingered past its due date without there being any real reason to get rid of it. So, those are the kind of buildings that end up being haunted.
You mentioned earlier the Kirkbride type asylum. It's a type of asylum that was actually, they were spacious. There was a lot of square footage, and they're meant to be relaxing, which was a major change. The way that when they came about, I think it was the early 19th century. It was a major change in the way we thought about asylums. And yet we are so scared of them. Why? Why are we scared of a type of asylum that was meant to be relaxing, that was meant to be spacious, that we ourselves created?
Well, I think that the thing about psychiatry and psychology in general is that I think we forget how both new of a science it is and how rapidly it's changed in the past, even 200 years. I mean, our understanding of how the mind works and what we can do to heal people who are suffering, or what we can do, who actually is suffering and who is actually fine, and we're unnecessarily pathologizing. I mean, that stuff has changed so dramatically in the past 200 years. And, every time, every generation, it seems there's a kind of rethinking of what psychiatry could and should be doing. The thing is that architecture just doesn't keep pace with that kind of rapid change. I mean, buildings last unless you tear them down or they, are otherwise destroyed. I mean, buildings last for decades, if not centuries. And so, like we were talking about earlier with Eastern State, I mean, I think with a lot of Kirkbride asylums, I mean, they got scary. They got sort of, branded as haunted simply for the fact that they outlived their usefulness and didn't go anywhere.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Distillations.
Remember, Distillations is more than a podcast. It's also a multimedia magazine.
You can find our videos, stories, and every single podcast episode at distillations.org. And you'll also find podcast transcripts and show notes.
You can follow the Science History Institute on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for news and updates about the podcast and everything else going on in our museum, library, and research center.
This episode was produced by Mariel Carr and Rico Hernandez.
And it was mixed by Jonathan Pfeffer.
The Science History Institute remains committed to revealing the role of science in our world. Please support our efforts at sciencehistory.org/give now.
For Distillations, I'm Alexis Petrick.
And I'm Lisa Berry Drago.
Thanks for listening.